The top business stories live from the Sky Newsroom. Markets watch the oil price after the Iranian parliament votes to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. The government announces the first new industrial strategy for 8 years, with green energy taxes set to be slashed. Plus, what will that strategy mean for the UK's skills gap? We'll hear from the consulting giant, PwC. Very good morning. Welcome to Business Life on this Monday with me, Darren McCaffrey. Well, the government is today unveiling the first new UK industrial strategy for 8 years, with the Prime Minister promising to invest £2 billion over 4 years to cut energy prices for up to a quarter of thousands of pounds for businesses. The new British Industrial Competitiveness Scheme would reduce electricity costs for more than 7,000 energy-intensive sectors. Well, delighted to say we can speak to Greg Clark. He's former Secretary of State, of course, for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, who was the last Secretary of State to unveil an industrial strategy. That was back in 2017 for Theresa May. He's currently, though, a member of Labour's Industrial Strategy Advisory Council. Greg, very good morning.
Good morning, Darren. Good
to you. We're going to talk about the industrial strategy in just 1 second, but I do want to reflect on, obviously, the big news today, indeed over the weekend, is what we've seen when it comes to Iran and concerns, particularly about the impact it may well have on the oil price and indeed on the global economy. And it is a reminder, isn't it, that governments can strategise all they want, but international affairs can also weigh heavily.
Well, that is true. And I think if you look back on the last 10 years, we've got this, we've had Russia-Ukraine, we've had COVID, which was an international crisis. Things come out of a clear blue sky often, but I think that, and I think we'd be talking more about some of the big breakthroughs in technology. I know you talk about on this show quite a bit, had it not been for these things. But I think even with that, and today is a case in point, this is an important announcement. It's obviously not going to be the most talked about thing, but actually you need to have a foundation that can generate confidence in a country. And so it may not be kind of top of the UK news today, but I think it will be very important over the years ahead.
But I suppose, Greg, what I'm trying to get is that, obviously, and we'll get on to the detail about the money being spent in terms of trying to lower the costs of energy for industry, so when it comes to energy, and yet, this comes on a day in which we're all watching that oil price.
Well, that's right, but the essence of a long-term strategy is that it has to be able to withstand the buffeting of events that over the long term can't be specifically predicted. And so we need to be more resilient, not just in energy, frankly, but in many different supply chains. I think one of the lessons of COVID is that we need to make sure that we can lay our hands on goods and services. And one of the big focuses of this industrial strategy, one of the 8 sectors, is clean energy, making sure that we are a country that can depend on energy supplies and can have them at a competitive price, because it is, you've got a hand tied behind your back, certainly in advanced manufacturing industry, if your energy costs are not competitive.
Well, let's talk about that. As you say, the government are talking about trying to invest, I think, £2 billion over the next 4 years, effectively to try and distort the energy market, if you like, in the UK here. Is this right, to lower costs for certain businesses that use a lot of energy? Because we are at an international disadvantage in that our companies pay way higher for energy compared to our peers.
Yeah, I think it's not so much distorting it as correcting some of the distortions that are there. We need to have in my view, a kind of big reform of energy markets, and the government have committed to do that. The prices in this country are out of line with others, despite the fact that we have very good sources of renewable energy coming in at a low price. But this is a competitive situation now, and I think the government are right to act on those industries that are particularly exposed, manufacturing industry, including steel, ceramics, cement making, to make sure that we don't lose those industries while we transition to what I think has to be in the long term a more competitive and more comparable set of energy prices.
What do you think has got wrong in the past here, though, Greg? And I just don't mean with energy prices. I mean with industrial strategies in this country. I read a piece that you had written, welcoming the fact that the government, clearly in what you're doing now, that they are investing long-term in things like infrastructure.
Yeah.
Then you look back at last week and HS2, my word, delayed again.
Yeah.
I mean, why? I mean, this stuff shouldn't be that complicated. We've been building railway lines and infrastructure for hundreds of years, and yet we still can't seem to get it right.
Well, I think you put your finger on it. I think we've taken too short-termist an approach to policy when other countries around the world have been able to generate a kind of broad consensus around policy stability for the long term, particularly like on things like infrastructure, investment in skills, investment in research and development. These things pay dividends over the long term, and coming in, sort of tearing things up, sort of scrapping them, is not only doesn't put down the foundations necessary on which to grow, but actually it sends a distress call to investors to say that there is policy instability here, and they will then look for long-term investments to other countries. So it's really important that we have a long-term plan. As it happens, I rate the content of it. I think it's done seriously. But just to have something that you can tell the rest of the world anyway, that this is what we're about, this is what our policy environment is, it's important that that is stable. And I hope that it'll have a broad consensus, including across parties, because it's very much in our national interest that investors thinking about investing in Britain don't think that things are going to chop and change every few years.
And Greg, just very finally, as a kind of former politician, can we call you that? I mean, how much does politics matter in all of this? Because, yes, we're talking about an industrial strategy. We're talking about a skills strategy. That matters. We're also talking, effectively, aren't we, about devolving power to maybe make the north of England more competitive to a degree. But is this also fundamentally about the Prime Minister looking over his shoulder at Nigel Farage?
No, I think you mentioned the empowering the great cities and regions of our country. I think that's a good example of something that has proceeded on the basis that it was right. The idea that, whether it's Manchester or the West Midlands, should not have had the clout nationally in government that the equivalents of other cities around the world have had, that has been changing in recent years under the coalition government, under the Conservative government, and is continuing on this government. It's an example of, there's plenty of room for politics. Every day in the House of Commons, there's plenty to have a big scrap about. But sometimes where things are for the long term, I think it helps, and I think it's, sometimes the best politics is no politics, to be responsible and serious, and for all parties to kind of commit to stability on things that have been well put together, have been approached in a kind of researched way. I think it's the right thing for the country, and actually I think it's the right thing for any party that commits to it. OK, Greg Locke, we really appreciate your time this morning. Former Business Secretary and, of course, a member now of the Government's Industrial Strategy Advisory Council. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Iran's parliament has approved the closure of a major shipping lane in the Persian Gulf after the US struck Iranian nuclear sites over the weekend. 2 supertankers U-turned before entering the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil passes, raising the spectre, of course, of higher energy prices for us all. Well, that caused oil to briefly spike to a 5-month high earlier. It's since come back a little bit. As you can see, though, it's up about 0.5% there at nearly $78 a barrel. And that's obviously having an impact somewhat on the global markets. If we look at how the FTSE is doing today, it's actually up a fraction. Now, in part, that might be because if oil prices go up, it is good news for oil companies, which BP and Shell are pretty big players on the FTSE 100. Let's get more on this. Let's speak to Russ Mould. He's Investment Director at AJ Bell. Russ, very good morning, as always, to you. Really interesting. Obviously, oil is up. Things could escalate. there is a sense of anticipation, concern, but not yet panic. Is that fair to say?
It is. I mean, the oil price is up by nearly a fifth over the month anyway. So there is some element of oil traders having run for cover. So that's probably partly one reason why the oil price is showing a pleasing almost display of calm this morning. Also, Iran, I believe, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert on the politics of what's going on in Tehran, I promise you, but I certainly understand that this is the closing the Straits of Hormuz is a threat that Tehran has made on many occasions before and not followed through. And it could conceivably be an act of economic self-harm to do so, as it's the major lane for Iran's 2 million barrels of oil that it exports daily, so that they have good reason to think twice about doing that. And also reading the weekend papers, again, I'm no expert on what's going on in Washington, but there seem to be lots of Republicans who aren't very pleased about American involvement, and maybe oil traders are thinking, well, President Trump, for all of his social media posting over the weekend, may find some of his room for manoeuvre limited if he wished to get further involved.
As you say, it's quite difficult to work out. Many people would say closing down that strait would be Iran cutting off its nose in spite of its face, given the fact that lots of that oil goes to China. But we do know things can escalate. It is a major shipping lane, and that could add to uncertainty in a world where, frankly, business finds very little certainty these days.
Oh, it could. I mean, we've still got we haven't talked about them for a change today, so it's my fault for bringing them up, but we've still got the reciprocal tariffs looming over us on the 9th of July. President Trump is saying that they're going to be out imminently. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is saying, well, any country that's negotiating in good faith, we may give them good time. We may give them more time. So I know that if I was in negotiations, I'd say, well, I'm negotiating in good faith. Give me more time, please. But they could still be seen as potentially inflationary if they come in. There's the US appeals decision on that in the courts on the 31st of July, where the betting seems to be Trump may actually lose and therefore have an excuse to find an off-ramp for the tariffs anyway, if he wants one. So there are all sorts of cross-currents there. I guess the worst-case scenario for investors would be repeat of the 1970s. Two major oil price shocks due to unrest in the Middle East, rampant inflation, galloping government debt. You could argue similar stresses to what we're seeing now. And they were a terrible decade for investors unless you owned an awful lot of gold. So that would be the worst case scenario. And I'm sure one or two people have been looking at that because that's one of the reasons why gold's done so well over the past 12 months.
And we talk about the fact there are always losers, but there are winners too. Russia may well be a winner on all of this, but also the big oil companies themselves.
Yeah, and it's interesting. If you look at oil companies overall, their the way that they've performed relative to the rest of the stock market. In the US, for example, the American oil companies are now just 3% of the American stock market capitalization. The long-run average there is 8 to 10%. The peak is 16. The numbers aren't quite dramatic in the UK, but BP and Shell are not as influential as they used to be. So it still feels as if oil investors are looking at oil over the long term thinking, nah, it's a bit of a wasting asset because we are going to move to a less carbon-intensive, greener future. So there's still a lot of scepticism there. If you think these tensions will continue, therefore it may focus a few minds on oil and energy security and perhaps bring them back into fashion in a way in which perhaps we wouldn't like to think about.
Just very finally, though, Russ, isn't what's changed, and you're making parallels there with the 1970s or even the early noughties when we saw, obviously, the war in Iraq or indeed in the 1990s, is that the United States itself is way less reliant on Middle Eastern oil. It's not as important as it once was, given the shale gas explosion that we've seen and the fact that the United States now is not just energy sufficient, but it actually exports its own oil.
Yeah, and it's now 13 million barrels a day of production. It's just about the world number one. So shale has been a huge game changer for the US. That is one thing that could be very different. I went to a brilliant conference a couple of weeks ago which talks about a lot about American exceptionalism, said that 2008 was the starting point of it. A weird year to think about because that was when Lehman Brothers went down and nearly took everything with it. But it was also iPhone and shale year. And so maybe you could argue the foundations are there. So I thought that was a very interesting observation. So that could ease a little bit of the pressure off. Equally, it could encourage America to turn away if it can keep that oil sufficiency going. But there is anecdotal evidence that is peaking out as well. And don't forget, the American oil reserves, its own oil inventories, are actually at the lowest levels, I think, since 1986, if you look at the US Energy Information Agency website. So even there, things might be a little bit tighter than we'd like to think. OK,
fascinating stuff. As always, a pleasure. Russ Mulder, thank you very much indeed from AJ Bell. Thank you. Well, let's return back now to the government's industrial strategy. Speak to Lord Richard Harrington. He's chairman of Make UK and a former parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Department of Energy. Business and Industrial Strategy. Lord Harrington, thank you very much indeed for your time. Let's reflect on this industrial strategy. We're going to get the details this afternoon in the House of Commons, but we've got a general gist of what the government are likely to announce. What's your impression of it?
Well, as far as Make UK is concerned, there's two aspects to it. First of all, as Greg Clark said on the interview before last, he and I worked with Greg on the last industrial strategy, that we need, as a country, a 10-year view for investors to take, where there's consistency over many different sectors as to which races this country is going to be in and how we're going to win them. But that's the first thing. But the second thing that I think is really critical is the fact that the government has listened very carefully to representations from Make UK about the disadvantage our members have in manufacturing products when their energy prices are, in some cases, more than twice that of our competitors in France and Germany. And I must commend Jonathan Reynolds, Secretary of State, for listening to us, listening to the reasoned arguments, and he's given a very good policy, as far as I'm concerned, which will make them competitive with the other countries in Europe.
Your expectation is that, yours and other companies will now benefit from lower energy prices. Do you have any idea what that will be, how much it will save, what difference it will make?
Well, to give you an example, most of our competitors are paying approximately 14 pence per kilowatt hour for their power. And in this country, it's been in excess of 30 pence. This is really significant, and it will be helped tremendously for our automobile industry, for aerospace, ceramics, and lots of other uses. So this is really absolutely critical to us, and I commend the government for doing it.
You talked about trying to win the kind of global race there in terms of not just old school manufacturing, but new technologies as well. Is it your sense, though, that we've got the scale in this country to kind of win those global challenges when you're competing against the European Union, the United States, China, for example?
Well, we've got a lot of things going for us. For example, we have excellent spin-offs from universities, which are basically the basis of many of our advanced manufacturing businesses. And I think the government, in announcing a new way of helping finance them with what they've done for the British Business Bank, is another very good thing. I think that's, to us, a tremendous example. But if your question is, can we compete with mass volume production of commodity items where the technology element is comparatively low? Well, we can't, but we never really could. But this is very exciting for us. And I also would like to say, and I should declare an interest here, that I did a review for the last government on how to improve our organisation of government for foreign direct investment, that there's a significant part of the industrial strategy is implementing this. So, yeah, I'm very encouraged by it.
And just very finally, as you heard there in my interview with Greg Clark, I'm fascinated in trying to get to the point where why are we so bad at some of the fundamental, or we don't seem that great at some of the fundamental things in terms of particularly things like infrastructure? We've had industrial strategies in the past, and yet, you're someone who's worked in government and in the private sector. What is it about our government's inability sometimes to properly plan, to stick to plans, to make plans work?
Well, I think one of the points is lack of consistency of policy. I mean, we've seen with the HS2, which was given the example in Greg's interview, complete changes of policy during it. I think the second thing is the lack of central government overriding local interests. This is a political point, but in the famous back tunnel, which cost £100 million, is something that, it's something you could smile at if it wasn't so serious, but that's giving in to local interest groups against the national interest. But I think thirdly, and I think this is really a fundamental point, that in our desire to use the private sector for all of these big projects, which is essential, but we've not developed a government officialdom, a government administration, which has the necessary skills to to control the private sector in the type of contracts where the procurement is. And again, I think the industrial strategy is really good for this.
Okay.
And I think that will improve.
OK, Lord Harrington, we really appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Sky News. Thank you. And don't forget, you can get more on the industrial strategy. So we're going to get the details this afternoon in the Commons, and indeed the rest of the money news, including focus on that oil price on our Money blog. All you need to do is scan the QR code on your screen now to access that on the Sky News app. OK, you're watching Business Live here on Sky News. Coming up in just a couple of minutes, we're going to hear from one of Britain's biggest consultancies, PwC, about what the industrial strategy means for jobs and indeed skills.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin.
The waters of Ireland and Britain should be home to great white sharks.
If there are great white sharks in this area, there's no reason they wouldn't come here to feed. It's basically a buffet on a beach. This could be not only a record-breaking storm, but potentially the most dangerous storm ever to hit Ireland.
Slide minutes, slide better. Flying minutes, fly better. Thank you.
Just going to bring you up to date with a little bit of breaking news here on Sky News. Just a note on, or an update on Iran and Israel. You may remember in the last couple of hours, we heard that Iran's nuclear facility at Fordow had been hit again, this time by an Israeli attack. Of course, it was the site of one of those US bunker-busting bombs over the weekend. Well, Israel, the military, is saying that it struck that enrichment site in order to obstruct access routes to it. So Israel saying the reason it struck the Fordow site again is in order to obstruct access routes to that site. They've been concerned about whether some of the material may have been moved over the last couple of days or weeks. But as I say, the IDF confirming that they have struck that site again. They are claiming it is to effectively stop access to routes coming in and out of that nuclear site. Now, let's return to that industrial strategy that we're due to hear from the government a little later on and get business reaction from one of the world's biggest consultancies. That is PwC, and delighted to say that Rachel Taylor is the government and health industry leader at PwC and joins me now. Very good morning to you. First of all, a lot of this industrial strategy is going to focus on energy and devolution of power, but it's going to focus on skills too, isn't it? Because for a long time in this country, there's been a mismatch, hasn't there, between the skills that companies want and the skills that the people of this country have had.
Yes, that's right. And we did some research last summer which looked at what businesses really look for to drive economic growth in their sectors and their regions. And what they're really looking for, one of the top three was skills, as you rightly say. So it is great to see that skills and talent has been prioritised in this way. Our economic analysis tells us, Darren, that actually if you were to uplift our technical skills to the level of, say, Germany, that would add another 125 billion onto UK GVA by 2035. So a really significant impact if you can really make a difference on skills.
And so when you talk about upskilling, what does that look like? Where does this money need to be spent? I mean, is this improving education in schools, or is it giving money to companies to effectively have apprentices again, etc.?
I think it's both. So it's really pleasing to see the government investing in technical education, as I've said earlier. I think particularly thinking about some of the priority sectors like construction, well, we had said you could impact and increase the value of the economy by about 15 billion by that investment in technical skills in construction. But actually as important is the upskilling, as you say. So by 2030, 80% of the workforce that are in the workforce today are already in the labour market. So investing in schools is really important, investing in apprenticeships is really important, but actually it's equally as important to invest in those upskilling of individuals who maybe with the technological revolution need to have a different set of skills to be fit for the future. And that's the piece that will miss the detail, Darren. It'd be good to understand how much focus there is on upskilling in the strategy.
And where are we underperforming massively? I mean, you talked about construction there, and there's been lots of issues. I mean, we need a lot of construction workers, not least of all for house building. But where is there a real mismatch in this country? Where is it most acute, our kind of skill shortage, if you like?
I think one of the key areas is thinking about technology adoption. So actually, all businesses across the economy are going to be impacted in some shape or form by technology. And actually, it's ensuring all workers are able to get the full benefits from that technology. So the big focus really, I think, is on technology adoption. And actually making sure both school leavers, apprenticeships, but also workers already, as I say, in the workforce, are able to take that advantage. And I think it's making sure the short courses referenced in the industrial strategy really focus on digital, as well as some of those, as you say, more specialist skills like defence, engineering, construction.
OK, Rachel, we really appreciate your time this morning. That's Rachel Taylor there from PwC. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to say, as I say, we are expecting that announcement in the Commons a little later on from Jonathan Reynolds, the Business Secretary, spelling out the details, actually, of that industrial strategy. And we will have more on that, and indeed, of course, the latest from the Middle East on Business Live at 4:30 this afternoon. Do go away then, if you can. Leah is up next. Goodbye.